Did you know that the villain in the original version of Hansel and Gretel wasn't a stepmother, but their biological mother? Today, we're uncovering the catastrophic historical event that this bedtime story was designed to preserve, a 3-year apocalypse that transformed ordinary parents into the very monsters we still fear in fairy tales. And here's what will haunt you. The most disturbing detail isn't the witch or the gingerbread house. It's the question every child instinctively asks when they hear this story. A question that reveals they already know the truth their parents are desperately trying to hide. Let's begin. Between 1315 and 1317, something catastrophic struck medieval Europe. The Great Famine wasn't just a period of hunger, it was an apocalypse that transformed ordinary parents into monsters and turned children into prey. Climate collapse brought endless rain, crops rotted in the fields, and within months, the social fabric of civilization began to unravel. In Bristol, the city's chronicles recorded something that reads more like a scene from hell than history. This wasn't metaphor. This was Tuesday in 1316. In one chronicle from eastern France, villagers are described killing the weakest children first, boiling their flesh in cauldrons meant for soup. Survivors recorded that the bones of the little ones lay in the ashes. A monk from Flanders wrote of seeing a mother clutch her dead child for 3 days before burying him, unable to let go, not from grief alone, but from the terrible calculation of whether his body could sustain the living. In another village, starving elders were tied to trees so that fewer mouths might allow the younger generation to survive another day. Edward II of England, the most powerful man in the realm, stopped at St. Albans in August 1315 and couldn't find enough bread to feed his royal entourage. When the King of England goes hungry, you know the apocalypse has truly arrived. And here's where the fairy tale begins to reveal its true face. When the Brothers Grimm first published this story in 1812, they weren't creating fiction. They were preserving a cultural trauma so profound that it could only be processed through the lens of fantasy. The Grimm informants, Marie Hassenpflug and Dorchen Wilde, didn't invent this tale. They assembled it from fragments of older lore, pieces of a collective nightmare that had been passed down through generations of survivors. And yet, the famine wasn't just remembered in chronicles and laws. It seeped into family memory. Which is why, when the Grimms recorded Hansel and Gretel centuries later, the real horror surfaced not in the witch, but in the mother herself. Now you need to understand something crucial about the version of Hansel and Gretel you think you know. The evil stepmother who coldly plots to abandon the children in the forest. She didn't exist in the original. In the Grimm's 1812 manuscript, that character was simply called the mother, the biological mother. The woman who gave birth to these children was the one urging their abandonment, calculating that 2 deaths in the forest were better than 4 deaths at home. But by 1857, something had changed. Wilhelm Grimm, in his study in Kassel, Germany, quill in hand, methodically crossing out the word Mutter, mother, and replacing it with Stiefmutter, stepmother, every single instance. By the 19th century, Germany had undergone a transformation. The mother had become sacred in German society. She embodied piety, virtue, and the moral soul of the household. The Biedermeier era, stretching from 1815 to 1848, had created a middle class that demanded uplifting, moralizing entertainment. They could accept a witch who ate children, but a mother who abandoned them? Unthinkable. Maria Tatar, the Harvard folklore expert, notes that roughly half of all children in 19th century Germany were growing up with one biological parent and one step-parent due to the high mortality rate during childbirth. The Brothers Grimm invented a scapegoat, the stepmother, a stock villain who could absorb all the cruelty that real mothers had carried in famine memories. Jack Zipes, the fairy tale scholar, believes the Grimms made these changes because they held motherhood sacred. The father, originally complicit in the plan, was rewritten as reluctant and compassionate. New dialogue was inserted. "I do feel sorry for the poor children," lines that never existed in the original telling. The Grimms were sanitizing a memory that had become too terrible to confront directly. The idea that a mother could abandon her children to die had become literally unspeakable. Yet the original truth bleeds through in the story's structure. Notice how after the children defeat the witch, their stepmother mysteriously dies at the exact same moment. The tale itself remembers what the Grimms tried to make it forget, that the witch and the mother were always the same person, two faces of the same desperate horror. But if the mother's betrayal was the wound at the heart of the story, the House of Gingerbread was its scar, a structure so impossible it could only have been built from famine's most twisted memories. The gingerbread house stands as perhaps the most psychologically disturbing element of the entire tale, and once you understand what it represents, you can never see it the same way again. During the Great Famine, there were documented cases of adults luring starving children with promises of food. The historical records are fragmentary, written in Latin and hidden in monastery archives, but they speak of horrors that map perfectly onto our fairy tale. Think about the witch's methodology for a moment. She doesn't simply capture and eat the children immediately. She fattens Hansel in a cage while forcing Gretel to help prepare the meals. This isn't fantasy. This is a traumatic memory of how starvation cannibalism actually worked. The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents. Graves were opened and the newly dead claimed as food. People would plan, prepare, rationalize. They would preserve bodies with salt, hide them, portion them out to last through the winter. The witch checking Hansel's finger each day to see if he's fat enough? That's not a storyteller's imagination. That's a survivor's testimony, dressed up in metaphor to make it bearable to tell. The gingerbread house itself, a structure made entirely of food in a world defined by hunger, represents the ultimate perversion of nurture. It's the maternal promise of sustenance transformed into a death trap. And this connects to a darker psychological truth that runs through the entire narrative. In times of extreme famine, the very people meant to protect you become your greatest threat. The gingerbread house was just the lure. The real terror begins when you realize the children already understood the trap, because they had seen it before. Hansel and Gretel aren't portrayed as helpless innocents, and this detail reveals something crucial about the world that created this story. From the moment Hansel overhears his parents plotting, he begins preparing. The pebbles, the breadcrumbs, these aren't lucky improvisations. They're the strategies of children who've learned that adults can't be trusted, that survival requires constant vigilance. Gretel's transformation is even more telling. She begins the story as the younger, more vulnerable sibling, but by the end, she's the one who tricks the witch into the oven. She becomes capable of murder, justified murder, but murder nonetheless. This is what famine does to children. It forces them to become something harder, something capable of doing whatever is necessary to survive. The fact that children across Europe instantly understood and embraced this tale tells us something horrifying about the medieval childhood experience. These weren't sheltered innocents being introduced to the concept of danger through a cautionary tale. These were children who recognized their own reality reflected back at them, albeit dressed in the costume of fantasy. But Hansel and Gretel were never alone. Across Europe, the same nightmare resurfaced, each version remembering what the others tried to forget. Across Europe, different versions of this story emerged, and each cultural variant preserves different aspects of the original horror. In Russia, the Baba Yaga tales tell of orphaned siblings encountering a witch whose house stands on chicken legs. But here's what folklorists have discovered. Those chicken legs aren't whimsical fantasy. Medieval granaries throughout Eastern Europe were built on stilts to protect grain from rats during famines, structures that, at a distance, resembled bird legs walking through the forest. Picture a starving child in 14th century Russia watching these elevated storehouses filled with grain they couldn't access, guarded by those who would let them starve rather than share. The house that walks isn't magic. It's a nightmare memory of granaries that fed some while others died, structures that could literally be moved to keep their precious contents away from the desperate masses. In one Russian variant, a brother and sister stumble into Baba Yaga's clearing. The house creaks, settling onto its skeletal legs, and inside waits a witch with iron teeth who speaks of grinding children into bread flour. She doesn't chase them for sport. She waits, patient as winter itself, knowing hunger will drive them to her eventually. The English Babes in the Woods strips away even the fantasy elements. In that version, recorded in Norfolk and dating back to at least 1595, 2 children are led into Wayland Wood by hired ruffians who can't bring themselves to commit the murder. So they simply abandon them. No witch, no gingerbread house, no triumphant return home. Just 2 small bodies in a forest, eventually covered with leaves by a robin. Local legend in Norfolk insists this really happened, that the ghosts of these children still haunt Wayland Wood, which locals call Wailing Wood, for the sounds of spectral sobbing heard among the trees. The village signs at Griston and Watton still depict the story today, as if the community can't let go of this ancient wound. Even more revealing is the Portuguese variant, where abandoned children must choose between a golden road and a silver road. One supposedly leads to safety, the other to the witch. But here's the devastating detail preserved in the original Portuguese telling. Both roads lead to the witch. The choice is an illusion. Sometimes, no matter what path abandoned children take, they're doomed. The Portuguese remembered what the Germans tried to forget, that for many children during the Great Famine, there was no escape, no clever trick that could save them. The variants refused to let the hunger be forgotten, but then came an adaptation that did the unthinkable. By 1893, when Engelbert Humperdinck transformed Hansel and Gretel into an opera, European society had collectively decided to bury the truth completely. Picture the scene. December 23rd, the Hoftheater in Weimar, Germany. The theatre is decorated with pine garlands and flickering candles for Christmas. Well-dressed families fill the seats, children in their finest clothes, excited for a festive entertainment. In Humperdinck's version, the horror has been completely sanitized. The mother doesn't plot murder, she merely spills a pot of milk in frustration and sends the children to gather strawberries in the woods. There's no starvation, no calculated abandonment. Instead, magical creatures appear. A sandman who sprinkles dream dust, a dew fairy who wakes them with morning kisses, and 14 guardian angels who protect the sleeping children in an elaborate ballet. The audience that night watched children on stage sing the Abendsegen, the evening prayer, one of the opera's most beautiful melodies. When at night I go to sleep, 14 angels watch do keep. Parents in the audience smiled, perhaps wiping away a sentimental tear at the sweetness of it all. But then came the third act, even wrapped in Christmas pageantry, even with its magical creatures and happy ending. Humperdinck couldn't entirely escape the gravitational pull of the original horror. The witch still appears. She still locks Hansel in a cage. She still prepares her oven to cook children alive. In the heart of this Christmas spectacle, as families sat in their holiday finery, the ancient terror clawed its way back onto the stage. The witch, checking if Hansel is fat enough to eat, still performs that terrible daily ritual that survivors of the Great Famine would have recognized. The oven still glows with hellfire. Even dressed in tinsel and accompanied by a full Wagnerian orchestra, the cannibal's kitchen remained. Richard Strauss, who conducted the premiere, declared it a masterpiece. But what kind of masterpiece requires 14 angels to balance out one cannibalistic witch? The opera may have softened the tale into a lullaby, but lullabies don't last forever. Eventually, new storytellers would strip away the sweetness and remind us why Hansel and Gretel was never meant to comfort children at all. Something changed in the 21st century. Filmmakers and writers began stripping away the centuries of sanitization, returning to the tale's dark core. The 2020 film Gretel and Hansel presents the witch not as a caricature, but as something genuinely terrifying. Alice Krige plays her with a waxy, doll-like face that feels at once innocent and predatory. The visual language returns to medieval imagery, stark blacks, poisonous greens, the forest as a living maze of terror. The house doesn't sparkle with candy, it decays, sugar turning to rot, sweetness masking corruption. Neil Gaiman's 2014 graphic novel made the connection explicit, recasting Hansel and Gretel as modern Syrian refugees. Suddenly, the tale's relevance becomes undeniable. Children fleeing war and famine, abandoned by systems meant to protect them, facing predators who see their vulnerability as opportunity. The Great Famine of 1315 and the refugee crises of today collapse into a single, continuous nightmare. Gaiman understood what Humperdinck tried to forget. This isn't a story from the past. It's a warning that keeps coming true. Every child who's ever heard this story has asked the same question. Why didn't the parents just eat the children themselves? It's a question that seems to come from nowhere, yet every child asks it. And that instinctive question reveals the ultimate horror that the tale is built around. During the Great Famine, some did. The chronicles speak in fragments, in Latin circumlocutions, in holes where words should be. But the evidence is there. The jurisdictions that suddenly created new laws about unnatural acts against one's own blood. The church edicts about what constituted unforgivable sin. The mass graves where small bones were found, cracked open for marrow, mixed with the remains of adults who died shortly after. The witch in her gingerbread house isn't a separate evil that the children stumble upon by chance. She's the externalized horror of what their own mother had already contemplated. The cage where Hansel is fattened, the oven where Gretel is meant to burn. These are the instruments of a crime that existed first in the parental imagination. The forest journey isn't really about moving from safety to danger. It's about transitioning from one form of mortal threat to another, from slow starvation at home to a swift death in the woods. The genius of the tale is that it allows children to process an unbearable possibility, that under extreme circumstances, the people who are supposed to protect them might fail in the most fundamental way possible. By defeating the witch, Hansel and Gretel symbolically defeat the spectre of parental abandonment and betrayal. They return home with the witch's jewels, bringing prosperity to the family that tried to destroy them. It's a fantasy of forgiveness that real abandoned children during the Great Famine never got to experience. Hansel and Gretel endures because it carries within it a species memory of catastrophe. It's a survival manual disguised as a fairy tale, teaching children that when civilization collapses, when food disappears, and when parents fail, you must become cunning, capable of violence, and trust only your siblings. The breadcrumb trail the birds eat? That's the lesson that some strategies fail, that the world itself will conspire against survival. The duck that ferries them across water in later editions? That's the random kindness that might save you when every human system has collapsed. Each symbol compresses hard wisdom about living through ruin. The tale spread across Europe, from Russia to Portugal, not for amusement, but necessity. It was a cultural vaccine, a measured dose of horror preparing children for the real thing. Communities that remembered famine through story were better prepared when hunger returned. And it did return, again and again. The 30 Years' War, the year without a summer in 1816, the Irish potato famine, the Holodomor. Each time, Hansel and Gretel waited, ready to whisper its terrible truths. Sometimes the gingerbread house is a trap. Sometimes mother becomes the monster. Sometimes the only way to live is to push the witch into her own oven. This is why we still tell it, not because we've forgotten, but because some part of us remembers. Some part knows civilization is always 3 meals from collapse, that the line between parent and predator is thin, and that children must learn these truths, even if we can only bear to tell them through the veil of once upon a time.